Today we're going to talk about how students taking the ACT with extra time accommodations can use their time wisely on the ACT exam. Alexis Avila here at our office in Wellesley, Massachusetts. For questions or tutoring in person or online, visit preppedandpolished.com. If you're a phone person, call us 781-753-9951. And remember, if you find value watching these videos, smash that like button, click the subscribe button, and click the bell to get notifications for future videos. Thank you. Now we're going to talk about the timing accommodations for the ACT exam for students who have extra time, either time and a half or double time. Now there are a couple different strategies that we're going to be talking about today. The first of which we're going to talk about are the overall strategies for the test. Now, the ACT is notorious for a much more faster-paced test. So having extra time is going to be a benefit for those students who especially need it. Now, when we look at the extra time accommodations on the ACT, sometimes those can range in the amount of time given. Some students will have 50% time, which we call time and a half. Some students will have 100% time or double time on the test. For right now, we're going to be discussing time and a half, 50% more time on the test. Now, if we're taking the test with 50% more time, one of the main things we want to focus on for students is how we can keep pacing and stamina at a high level. Now that the student has extra time, we really want to make sure that the student has enough energy to get through the section and then do 2 or 3 more sections after that. So a lot of times when we work with students, we want to get their pacing down to pretty much a science for each section of the test. And then once we get it for each section of the test, our next priority is to make sure from one section to the next that they have that energy to push through the entirety of the test. Now, yes, with timing accommodations such as time and a half or double time, we do have instances of more breaks allotted for each student depending on the section and depending on the test. So we want to make use of those breaks as often as possible. And if the student has unlimited breaks, well, we want to make note of that so we can make sure that they take breaks at strategic moments of the test. Now, another thing to keep in mind is question prioritization, especially for the math section where questions get harder from 1 to 60. So we want to think about what questions are going to need more time and how we can allocate time for those questions, but also prioritize those easier questions when we're able to recognize this. Now, some students might have question type preferences. They might be more accomplished within terms of punctuation rules or grammar rules, and they struggle with rhetoric on the English section, for example. Or on the math section, these students might thoroughly enjoy geometry, but not so much the algebra. So if we can prioritize certain questions that for them are easier, this is going to help them overall use their time to their benefit. Now, one final overall strategy is now that you have extra time, please try and review and reread the questions. However much review you can do is better than no review, even if it's just going back over a question and double checking. So, for example, I chose this, why? And if the student can explain, this is why I chose it, that's great. But we want to make sure that they can at least allocate time to do that. Now, looking at each section of the ACT, the important thing to keep in mind is how much time you have for each one. And then based on that timing, what works best for each individual student. For today's purposes, we're going to be talking more general strategies for each section though. When we're working one-to-one with students, we'll be taking some of these strategies and manipulating them to work best for the student. So the first section that we're going to be looking at here is the English section. That comes first on the exam. Now, standard time's 45 minutes. And how the ACT changes this to time and a half is that they round it all the way up to 70 minutes for that section. And that's great considering we have 5 passages, which comes out to be about 13 minutes per passage. Now, 13 minutes per passage might not seem like a lot when each passage has 15 questions, but considering it was at 9 minutes before with standard time, well, the 13 minutes with the extra time is pretty good. Now, the more important thing here for the English section is we do have more time to spend on those kinds of reading contextual evidence questions or rhetorical based questions that take a little bit more time of the student's time to answer. Now, these questions are sometimes going to be the ones that are like, should the author add this sentence here? Should the author delete this here? Or sometimes even sentence order questions. Now, as one can imagine, these types of questions take up a little bit more time because you need to look at the context, the paragraph that question's coming from. So it's important for students to have that time to look over it. Another thing we can use this extra time for is making subtle changes in punctuation questions. So now you can use the extra time to check each answer choice and see the subtle punctuation changes from one answer choice to the next. This answer choice, so for example, this answer choice has a comma, mark it. Okay, this answer choice doesn't have a comma, still mark it. And having that extra time on those punctuation questions and also those grammar questions, invaluable. Now, as for the math section of the ACT, this one is actually very straightforward. So standard time, you have 60 minutes. Now, time and a half, it bumps it up to 90 minutes. And this is where we're going to have a couple of potential routes to go for a student to work on, depending on their ability level. Now, on the math section, time allocation and question prioritization is very important. For most students, we want to focus on spending as much time on those first 30 to 45 questions to ensure getting the easier questions correct. Note that the first 32, sometimes 40 questions out of the 60 are more foundational, covering foundational elements of certain topics of math, such as linear equations, systems of equations, basics in geometry, starting points in trigonometry, or even logarithms and exponent rules. So it's a priority for the student to be able to answer as many of those questions as possible correct, considering the harder questions are going to make it much more difficult to answer. Now, there's 2 routes we can go this way. One is to give more time for the bulk of the questions, aka if a student is aiming for those first 40 to 45 questions correct, we want to take those 90 minutes and apply as much time to those questions as possible as if you're trying to answer the first 45 questions in. Let's say now, let's say 60 or 70 minutes so that a student can ensure all those are correct. Now, that might be one route for the student. Another route would be to answer as many of the easier questions as possible in as little time as possible to then allocate the lion's share of your time for the harder tier questions. And the harder questions can range in terms of difficulty, in terms of content, but also in terms of time consumption. There are some questions that simply take a lot of time to answer. It's not that they're difficult, it's just that it is a laborious process. So it's good for students to at least be prepared for either scenario depending on how the test comes up. Now, we've worked with students before who we've decided they were going to spend a bulk of the time on the first 30 to 45 questions. And on the other, and I have other advanced students who go through the first 35 questions in 35 minutes so they can spend the rest of their time on the last 25 questions. Another thing to be thinking about for the math section is that there are 5 answer choices in this section as opposed to the other sections which have 4 answer choices. So process of elimination is really important. So utilizing that extra time to eliminate answers is going to help the student overall. Now at this point, when you're at the math section standard time, this is where you have your first break. So Now, because we're dealing with time and a half, you're more than likely going to have one, if not two breaks by the end of the math section. So you might have one during English and another one during math, and then another after the math. It's going to depend on the accommodations and the proctor. So it's good for each student to double check with the school or the proctor when they're allowed to take their break. Now, looking into the reading section, we go from 35 minutes, which is a very short amount of time for 4 passages and 40 questions, and now you get 55 minutes with your time and a half, which is just shy of an hour. So this makes it great to really have time to read the passage. Now, usually when I'm working with students with dealing with this section at standard time, 35 minutes is not a lot of time per passage, but 55 minutes, you have roughly 13 and a half minutes per passage. So we want to make sure how much time of that do you need to read the passage to comprehend it versus how much time do you need to answer the questions. Now, if a student's a fast reader and can retain information quickly, we'll have the student spend more of their extra time to answer the questions. Now, process of elimination and detailing where the evidence is coming from, all that can be very helpful when given the extra time. Now, for the science section, it's a very similar setup to the reading section, because the science section is pretty much reading, but with more visual representation of information and data. So that visual representation, those charts and tables, you're going to have more time to review now each chart and or table more thoroughly, noting the different axes, noting the patterns that are established either in the graph or in the table. It'll also help us to note the differences in terms of the studies, the experiments, and or the opinions of the scientists or students, but also in the setup of those experiments and studies. So this is really helpful for us to kind of make those distinctions while going through the section, because normally, again, you only have 35 minutes standard time, but in the science section you now have 55 minutes. So that's an extra 25 minutes to look through those subtle differences between each experiment and study. The extra 25 minutes, really going to help. Now, also on the science section, the extra time will also work well for a student to have time to mark up the questions more and know where that info is coming from. Most questions on the science section of the ACT, either in the question itself or in the answers, will indicate where the information is coming from. Now, the last section that we're going to talk about is the essay. Now, the essay is an optional part of the ACT still. And what we want to look at here is, instead of having a very limited time with the essay, we now have more time for the 3 main points of any kind of essay, which is outlining, revising, and examples. Now, most times when we talk with students, it's very hard to fit in that second one, revising or revisions, that we can put into the essay. However, with the little bit of extra time now, you might be able to have a student review parts of it, so that way at least they can check for comprehension and flow. Outlining, though, if you have more time to outline it, it sometimes negates the need to go over revisions. So, because if you have a more fully fleshed out outline, it will show and represent itself in the essay. However, we do want to make sure that we're not using up too much time to outline, so you have to make the necessary revisions and set forth your examples. Now, in terms of the examples and or details, if you have more time, it allows you to take more time to go into more depth on certain examples or provide another example where applicable. Now, the final part that we're going to talk about here is double time, if you're given the double time accommodation. If we're looking at double time for the ACT, each section is, as you can imagine, doubled in length. So English standard time of 45 minutes becomes 90 minutes. Math 60 becomes 120 minutes, and the reading and science, both at 35 minutes, becomes 70 minutes. Now, with double time scenario, there's going to be a couple of individual situations for each student that we have to consider. First of all, most students who are taking the test double time, I've had one or two take it triple time in fact, they'll not sit the test in one day. So it'll be a very important thing to determine right off the bat how many days are allotted for the student to take the test. Now, if the student is allowed 2 days, such as Saturday and Sunday, which is pretty common for the test, more than likely what they'll do is take the English and math one sitting and the reading and science in the next sitting, the next day. If they're taking the essay, that might have to be squeezed into the reading and science section on day 2, or they might have a third day for the essay. That's something to figure out with your proctor, and also determine what the ACT gives in terms of their accommodation requirements and rules. Now, if you have double time for any one of these sections, pretty much anything that I suggested before about having more time to go over stuff is reiterated. And what I'll say is you have now even more time to review. But if you're given double time, there's a reason for that. And so we want to make sure that we are not trying to spend too much time on material that the student might be able to get through with normal amount of time. So for example, if we have now 120 minutes, 2 hours for the math section, does that mean every single question, spend 2 minutes on it? Not necessarily. Should we still prioritize quantity of questions over specific questions? Of course. So if we need 90 minutes now, let's say for the first 40 to 45 math questions, okay, we'll work that into the program. That would enable then the student to have an extra 30 minutes for the last difficult 15 questions. If we're given double time, we just want to consider how we want to use that double time wisely. Now each student will have different ways they should use the double time, so make sure when prepping to work with your tutor, work on a pacing strategy that makes best sense for you and your goals. Okay, so now I've gone over a lot of different aspects of the ACT in terms of time and a half and double time. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us at Prepped and Polished to schedule either a call, or if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them specifically about timing, accommodations depending on your students' requirements and needs, as well as any additional timing accommodations or accommodations as a whole for the test. We're here to help you any way that we can, so please feel free to reach out to us at preppedandpolished.com. Good luck on your ACT exam, and I'll talk to you soon.